The desert does not forgive, and it certainly does not forget. Beneath the scorching Utah sun, where the red rock jaggedly pierces the horizon, a young woman stands amidst the swirling dust and the roar of high-performance engines. To the millions watching through a glass screen, Katelynn is the vibrant, fearless heart of a recovery empire, a symbol of mechanical grit and desert defiance. But behind the sun-drenched smiles and the adrenaline of a successful pull lies a far more complex tapestry of quiet expectation and the weight of a legacy carved from iron and sand. What happens when your identity becomes inextricably linked to the very wilderness that seeks to break you? How does one find a personal voice when it is constantly drowned out by the thunder of a V8 engine and the crushing pressure of digital fame? This is not merely a story of off-road rescues. It is a psychological descent into the soul of the desert's daughter, exploring the silent sacrifices made in the shadow of the mountains. The dawn in southern Utah does not arrive with a gentle glow. It breaks like a fever over the jagged, obsidian-edged horizons of Hurricane and Sand Hollow. Long before the world woke to the digitized hum of viral videos, there was only the wind, a low, mournful whistle scouring the ancient sandstone, carrying the scent of dry sage and oxidized iron. In the center of this vast, indifferent cathedral stood a child, small and preternaturally still against the monolithic backdrop of the red rock. Katelynn's early years were not measured in the milestones of a typical girlhood, but in the tactile reality of the desert's harsh demands. Her boots were perpetually caked in a fine, rust-colored silt, a physical manifestation of a land that seeks to claim everything it touches. To her, the desert was not a scenic vista. It was a living, breathing tutor, a silent giant that taught her the gravity of a mistake long before she understood the weight of a legacy. While her peers found comfort in the soft, predictable rhythms of suburban play, Katelynn's playground was the cold, unyielding steel of a recovery rig. She spent her formative hours tucked into the cramped, grease-scented corners of truck cabs, watching the world through a windshield streaked with dust. The air she breathed was a cocktail of diesel exhaust and the ozone that precedes a mountain storm. It was here, amidst the rhythmic clanking of heavy-duty chains and the strained, metallic groan of tension cables, that she learned a language far more complex than words. She began to understand the geometry of disaster, the precise angle of a winch, the structural integrity of a chassis buried in silt, and the invisible lines of force that dictated whether a vehicle would be saved or lost to the ravine. Yet, beneath this mechanical education, a quiet, psychological fracture began to form. To survive and thrive in this world, Katelynn had to mirror the men around her, the titans of the family trade who moved with a gruff, unspoken certainty. She watched them with a reverence that bordered on fear, recognizing in their calloused hands and sun-weathered faces a map of her own inevitable future. The internal conflict was a slow-burning ember, a desperate, primal need to belong to this masculine brotherhood of iron and grit, contrasted against a flickering, nameless desire for something softer, something entirely her own. She was a child of the wilderness, but she was also a prisoner of its expectations. Every successful recovery was a double-edged sword. It proved her worth to the lineage, but it also tightened the golden chains of her destiny. She was becoming a master of the machine, yet she felt her own internal machinery, her dreams, her fears, her budding identity, being quietly overwritten by the roar of the engines. The atmosphere of these early years was one of rugged isolation, a term that became the very foundation of her soul. There was a sanctuary in the solitude of the canyons, a sense that the red dust belonged only to her and the family whose name was etched into the local lore. But as the sun began to set on the era of private struggle, a new element entered the atmosphere, one far more intrusive than the Utah wind. It started with a single tripod, a black, mechanical eye set against the crimson sand, blinking with a sterile, red light. The silence of the desert was suddenly punctuated not by the wind, but by the artificial instruction to go again for the shot. Katelynn watched the lens, and for the first time, the desert felt small. As the first high-definition camera shutter clicked, freezing her image against the ancient stone, Katelynn felt a cold shiver that the sun could not warm. She realized her private sanctuary had been sold for a global audience, and the world was now leaning in, breathless, waiting for her to play a role she hadn't yet agreed to cast. The quiet, ancestral humming of the Utah desert was soon incinerated by the frantic, high-decibel roar of a digital revolution. As Matt's off-road recovery ascended from a local legend to a global phenomenon, the world of Katelynn transformed into a labyrinth of grease, chrome, and the unrelenting glare of LED studio lights. The shop, once a sanctuary of focused labor and father-daughter mentorship, had mutated into a high-pressure nerve center, a production floor where the scent of burnt transmission fluid mingled with the sterile heat of high-end servers. For Katelynn, the air grew thin, not from the desert elevation, but from the oxygen-depriving weight of a million expectant eyes. She was no longer merely a mechanic's apprentice or a daughter learning the ropes. She had been meticulously distilled into a character, a digital beacon of capability that the world demanded stay bright, regardless of the shadow it cast within her. This new existence was defined by a suffocating duality. On the recovery trail, her muscles burned with the genuine, physical exhaustion of wrestling 1,000-pound winches and wading through waist-deep silt under a sun that felt personal in its cruelty. But the physical toll was nothing compared to the invisible burden of the unbreakable persona. In the editing bays and on the vibrant thumbnails that flickered across millions of smartphones, Katelynn was the smiling, fearless heart of the operation, a symbol of grit that never faltered. The narrator observes her during these long production days, noticing the way her smile only reaches her eyes when the red recording light flickers off, and how her shoulders, once squared with natural confidence, now seemed to carry the tension of a suspension bridge under maximum load. She was living in a silicon shadow, where her worth was measured in retention rates and positive comment sections, a psychological prison built from the very fame she had helped construct. The turning point crystallized during a grueling, high-stakes recovery deep within the treacherous, sand-hollow dunes. The setting was cinematic in its hostility. The sand, a fine, orange powder that choked the air, shifted like a living beast beneath the heavy tires of the rigs. The production crew circled like vultures, their long-lens cameras capturing every bead of sweat, every furrowed brow. Katelynn was at the center of the storm, tasked with securing a complex snatch block anchor on a vehicle perched precariously on a collapsing ridge. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of hot sand and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Suddenly, the silence of the desert was shattered by the sickening, high-pitched snap of a mechanical failure. A hydraulic line burst, spraying hot fluid across the sand like lifeblood. In that moment, the carefully constructed image of perfection fractured. The mission was failing, but for Katelynn, the failure was deeper than a broken machine. As the cameras zoomed in to capture the drama, her internal armor began to flake away. She stood amidst the chaos, her hands stained black with oil, her chest heaving with a realization that she was performing her own life for an audience that thrived on her struggle. The crowd of production assistants and onlookers felt like a wall of mirrors, reflecting back a version of herself she no longer recognized. A profound sense of isolation washed over her, the realization that she was utterly alone in a crowd that only cared for the content of her crisis. She looked into the lens, not with the practiced spark of a YouTube star, but with the hollow, searching gaze of a woman wondering where her real self had gone. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the hollow, casting long, distorted shadows across the dunes, the recovery was eventually salvaged through sheer, desperate effort. But the psychological damage was done. Back at the shop, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the garage, Katelynn sat on the bumper of a rig, the silence of the night feeling heavier than the loudest engine. She was a ghost in her own empire, haunted by the question of who she was supposed to be when the cameras finally stopped rolling and the world moved on to the next viral moment. The duality had become a schism, and the girl who loved the desert felt she was being buried alive by the very mountain of iron and silicon she had climbed. In the final cut of the day's footage, tucked between the high-octane music and the triumphant cheers, there remained a single, unedited moment. Katelynn, leaning against a cold steel fender, closing her eyes for a split second with a look of such profound, soul-deep exhaustion that it hinted at a brewing internal storm. leaving the millions behind the glass screens to wonder. How much longer can she carry the weight of the recovery world before she finally breaks? The relentless cadence of the digital machine eventually outpaced the natural rhythm of the human heart. As the success of the recovery empire scaled toward the stratosphere, Katelynn found herself caught in a centrifugal force that threatened to tear her identity from its moorings. The desert, once her sanctuary of absolute silence, had become a cacophony of expectations. The physical toll was evident in the way she moved, a slight, weary stiffness in her joints from years of wrestling steel against sand. But it was the psychological erosion that truly signaled the arrival of her darkest hour. We find her now retreating, not into the shop or the spotlight, but into the primitive, unmapped reaches of the Utah backcountry, where the only audience is the ancient, unblinking eye of the canyon walls. The atmosphere here is heavy, thick with the sharp, medicinal scent of crushed sagebrush and the chilling, hollow reality of burnout. The narrator observes Katelynn as she sits on a jagged outcrop, her silhouette swallowed by the encroaching indigo of a desert twilight. This is a psychological autopsy of a woman who has become a stranger to herself. In the oppressive quiet, her fears of inadequacy begin to howl. Despite the millions of views and the global acclaim, a toxic guilt festers within her, the guilt of wanting something more, or perhaps something entirely different, than the life that has brought her such undeniable success. She is the tough girl of the off-road world, a title she never asked for, but was forced to wear like a suit of armor that has grown 2 sizes too small. In this state of profound isolation, the scars left by the digital age begin to weep. The narrator delves into her memory, surfacing the spectral voices of anonymous critiques that echo in the canyons of her mind. The faceless thousands who dissect her every movement, her appearance, and her technical skill with a cold, detached cruelty. The loss of privacy has become a physical weight, a sense that she is never truly alone, even here. She reflects on the crushing expectation to be the invincible face of a brand, a persona that leaves no room for the vulnerability of being human. Every like felt like a brick added to a wall, and every share felt like a piece of her soul being bartered for a moment of fleeting relevance. She is lost in the very landscape she was born to conquer, wandering through a desert of her own making. The scene shifts to a late-night vigil beside a dying campfire, the embers casting long, dancing shadows against the red rock. In the quietude of her own reflection, Katelynn confronts the terrifying truth. The character has nearly consumed the person. She remembers the girl who loved the desert for its indifference, not its potential for content. The dialogue is internal, a brutal interrogation of her own purpose. She weighs the legacy of her name against the sovereignty of her spirit. She contemplates the fear of disappointing those who built this world, and the even greater fear of losing herself entirely to the gears of a mechanical destiny. The internal struggle is no longer about a stuck vehicle. It is about a stuck soul, wedged between the rock of duty and the hard place of personal survival. As the moon rises, silvering the edges of the precipice, Katelynn stands at the brink of an emotional abyss. The narrator watches her as she gazes out over the vast, darkened expanse of the barren lands, where the wind seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The silence is no longer peaceful. It is a vacuum, waiting to be filled by a single, life-altering decision. The psychological pressure has reached its terminal velocity. She is at the intersection of who she was told to be and who she is becoming in the dark. The weight of the empire, the expectations of the fans, and the shadow of her mentors all converge on this single point in time, forcing a reckoning that cannot be televised. As the first light of a cold dawn touches the rim of the canyon, Katelynn stares out over the edge of the precipice, her face a mask of terrifying clarity. A decision is made. A choice that will either see her walk away from the empire forever or force her to reinvent her very soul within its grinding gears. And as she turns her back to the abyss, the world remains entirely unaware that the Katelynn they knew has already vanished. The desert does not change for the seeker. It simply waits for the seeker to change. When Katelynn finally descends from the high ridges of her emotional exile, she does not return as a fugitive of her own fame, but as a woman who has conducted a quiet, violent revolution within her own soul. The setting returns to the familiar, blood-orange dirt of Hurricane, Utah, yet the atmosphere has undergone a molecular shift. The air no longer feels heavy with the static of 1,000 cameras. Instead, it vibrates with a new, grounded energy, an energy born of agency rather than obligation. The narrator observes her moving through the shop in the early morning light, her movements stripped of their performative edge. She picks up a wrench not because a script requires it, but because her hands understand the metal. The grease beneath her fingernails is no longer a costume. It is a chosen badge of a craft she has finally reclaimed as her own. She turns the key, and the engine roars to life. A deep, guttural growl that echoes through the ancient canyons like a declaration of independence. As the gears engage and she drives toward the shimmering, distant horizon, the screen fades to black, leaving the world to wonder. What new, untamed territory will the daughter of the desert conquer next, now that she is finally driving her own life?